For 41 years, a man in Biloxi, Mississippi, laced up the same pair of work boots at 4:45 every morning before the sun came up. And for 41 years, a man in Portland, Oregon, lay in a VA hospital bed staring at the ceiling because the boots he had worn home from Vietnam in 1973 still sat at the foot of his bed, and he had not put them on since. Neither man knew the other existed. One of them walked through the Family Feud studio doors on a Tuesday in October 2021 in his socks. No shoes, no explanation, carrying a folded flag in both hands. The other one was Steve Harvey. And when Steve looked down at this man's feet and then back up at his face, and when this man, 83 years old, 6'1", back still straight as a flagpole, met his eyes and didn't blink, Steve Harvey stopped the entire production, walked off his own set, and did not come back for 11 minutes. It was a Tuesday in October 2021 at CBS Television City in Los Angeles, California. Harold Eugene Briggs, U.S. Army, 1st Cavalry Division, 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in Korea, recipient of 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart he kept in a coffee can in his kitchen because he said a drawer wasn't formal enough, but a display case was showing off. Had flown from Biloxi with his daughter Renata, 44, his son-in-law Darnell, his granddaughter Simone, 17, and his great-granddaughter Amara, who was 6 and had decided before boarding the plane that California was probably full of movie stars and she was going to find one. Harold was the oldest contestant in Family Feud history. The show's records confirmed this 3 days after the taping. He was 83 years, 2 months, and 11 days old. The competing family, the Weston family from Charlotte, North Carolina, were 4 adult brothers and their mother, June, 67, a retired schoolteacher who had taught 4th grade for 31 years and still corrected people's grammar in conversation without noticing she was doing it. June Weston had been watching Family Feud since the original run with Richard Dawson, and had opinions about every host. She said Steve Harvey was the best one, and she said it to his face when they met backstage, and Steve had looked at her and said, "I'm going to remember you said that." June had told him he should write it down. But nobody in that studio knew why Harold Briggs was not wearing shoes. The boots had a history that Harold did not discuss unless directly asked, and sometimes not even then. He had bought them in 1963 at a hardware store in Gulfport, Mississippi, for $4.70, with money he had earned cleaning gutters for a neighbor. He was 25 years old and had just been told he was being deployed. He wore those boots through 2 tours and a war that came home inside him the way wars do. Not all at once, but slowly, in the particular silence of 3 a.m., and the particular flinch at the sound of a car backfiring, and the particular way he could not, for 11 years after he came home, sit with his back to a door. He had worn those boots for 41 years at the chemical plant in Biloxi. He had worn them on the day his wife, Dorothy, was buried in 2009. He had worn them to every one of Renata's school events, every graduation, every Sunday church service for 6 decades, because Dorothy had once told him that a man who shows up in good boots is a man who means to be somewhere, and Harold had taken that as the most useful piece of advice he had ever received. 3 months before the Family Feud taping, the boots had finally given out. The sole of the left one had separated from the upper, clean across the toe box, opening like a mouth. Harold had taken them to 2 different cobblers. The first told him the leather was too far gone. The second told him the same thing and offered to sell him a replacement pair. Harold had said no to both of them and walked home in the split boots and put them on the front porch and had not worn any shoes since. His daughter Renata had not understood this at first. Then she had. She had bought him 3 pairs of shoes in the intervening weeks, a pair of white New Balances, a pair of leather loafers, a pair of slip-ons with memory foam that she had read were good for older feet. Harold had thanked her for each pair and placed each pair in the closet without opening the boxes. When the Family Feud producers had called to confirm travel arrangements, Renata had mentioned to the coordinator, quietly, that her father might show up without shoes, and the coordinator had paused for a long moment, and then said that was fine, and that they would note it. Harold had carried the folded flag with him from Biloxi in his carry-on bag. It was not his flag. It was the flag from Dorothy's funeral, the one the honor guard had folded and presented to Renata, because Harold had been sitting too still to receive it himself, and Renata had held it through the entire burial and then pressed it into Harold's hands on the drive home, and Harold had not let go of it since. He carried it on the plane. He carried it through the airport. He carried it into CBS Television City with both hands, the way you carry something you are not willing to set down. Nobody in that studio knew what Simone had told her mother the night before they flew out. Simone was 17. She was the one who had nominated the family for Family Feud, written the application herself in her junior year English class as a project about oral history, and submitted it without telling anyone. When the call came, Harold had looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "You did this?" And Simone had said yes and braced herself, and Harold had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Good." That was the whole conversation. In Harold's family, "good" from Harold was equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. What Simone had told her mother was that 2 weeks before the trip, she had walked past Harold's bedroom at night and heard him talking. She had stopped in the hallway and listened. Harold was talking to Dorothy. He was telling her about the boots. He was saying that he knew it was foolish, that it was just leather and rubber, but that he had worn them every day for 60 years, and it felt like losing something he didn't have words for, and that he was sorry he hadn't taken better care of them, and that he wished she were there because she would know the right thing to do, and she always did. Simone had stood in the hallway for 4 minutes. Then she had gone back to her room and not slept. She hadn't told anyone until the night before the taping. And that wasn't even the part that made Steve cry. The game started normally. Harold was composed, deliberate, the kind of competitor who buzzes in only when he is certain, and is certain more than people expect. He got 2 answers correct in the first round, both on the first buzz, and each time he answered, the audience applauded with a warmth that was particular to him. The kind that comes from recognizing someone who has earned the right to stand wherever they are standing. When Steve introduced him and read his service record aloud, 2 tours, Korea, 2 Bronze Stars, Purple Heart. Harold stood straight and looked forward and said nothing, the way men of that generation were trained to receive acknowledgement, with dignity and without display. Between rounds, Steve crouched beside him for a moment, the way hosts do, the informal check-in, and Harold looked at Steve's shoes and then at his own socked feet and said, entirely without self-pity, "Lost my boots. 60 years in those boots. Couldn't replace them. Figured I'd come anyway." Was carrying a secret that would soon change everything. Steve Harvey stood up. He looked at Harold for a long moment. Then he looked at the floor director and said, "Hold on." He walked off the stage, not into the wings, off the set entirely, through the door behind camera 3 that led to the production corridor. The floor director looked at the booth. The booth looked at the floor director. The audience of 211 people looked at each other. Harold Briggs stood in his socks and held his flag and waited, the way a man waits who has learned that the most important things require patience. 11 minutes later, Steve Harvey came back through the door behind camera 3. He was carrying a box. He walked to Harold Briggs, and he set the box down on the contestant platform, and he opened it. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a pair of boots, work boots, brown leather, the same style and approximate vintage as the ones on Harold's front porch in Biloxi. Steve had sent a production assistant sprinting to a Western wear store 4 blocks from the studio with Harold's approximate size. Renata had whispered it while Steve was gone, and $240 of Steve's own money. The studio fell completely silent. Harold looked at the boots in the box. He looked at Steve. His jaw moved once. "Put them on," Steve said quietly, not as a command, as an offering. Harold sat down in the contestant chair. He placed the folded flag across his knees. He reached into the box with both hands and took out the left boot first, then the right, and he put them on, and he laced them up, methodically, each eyelet, the way a man laces boots he means to wear for 60 years. When he was done, he stood up. He was 6'1" again. He had always been 6'1", but he was 6'1" differently now. The audience did not applaud. They understood somehow that this was not a moment for applause. June Weston, across the stage, had both hands over her mouth. Simone had her face buried in her mother's shoulder. Amara, 6 years old, was watching Harold's feet with complete absorption, the way children watch things that are important without knowing exactly why. Then Amara looked up at her great-grandfather and said it. "I just want him to stay." She wasn't talking to anyone in particular. She was talking to the room, the way small children sometimes do when they have a feeling too large for their chest, and it simply comes out. The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey's head dropped. His hand went to the back of his neck. He stood like that for a moment, head down, hand on his neck, not moving, and 3 members of the crew who had worked with him for more than a decade said later they had never seen that particular stillness in him before. He looked up. "Stop everything," he said. "I need to say something." He pulled his earpiece out. He looked at Harold. "I need you to hear this," he said, "because there are people at home who need to hear it too. And I think you already know it, but sometimes a thing needs to be said out loud by somebody else before it gets all the way in." He paused. "I know what it is to get to the end of yourself," Steve said. "I mean the real end. I wrote a letter to my family once, a goodbye letter. I was ready to mail it." He stopped. "Let that land. I'm only telling you that because I need you to understand what I mean when I say that the difference between that moment and this one is people. It's people who showed up. It's people who sat in the room. It's people who noticed the boots were gone." He looked at Simone. "It's a 17-year-old girl who stood in a hallway at night and listened and didn't look away." Simone's breath broke audibly. "You carried something for 60 years, Steve said to Harold, "that most people will never have to carry. You went where they sent you. You came home different, and you stayed anyway. You wore those boots every day so you could keep showing up, and when they gave out, you showed up anyway, in your socks, with your flag, because showing up is what you know how to do." His voice dropped. "You carried us all home. Every single one of us who never had to go." The studio fell completely silent for the last time. Then Harold Briggs reached out and put his hand on Steve Harvey's arm. He did not say anything. He just put his hand there and left it. Steve covered Harold's hand with his own. The crew broke, all of them. The woman on camera too, the boom operator, the segment producer who had come down from the booth, the floor director, 11 seasons, standing at the edge of the set with tears running straight down his face and not wiping them. But Steve wasn't done. He stood at the camera and he talked about the VA. He talked about the 8-month average wait time for mental health appointments in the Veterans Affairs system. He talked about the 6,000 veterans who die by suicide every year in the United States. Not a vague statistic, the specific number, 6,000, out loud. He talked about the boots. He talked about what it costs a man to show up every day for 60 years in the same pair of boots, and what it means when those boots finally give out and nobody notices. Then he turned to Harold. "We're going to do something," he said, "and it's going to have your name on it. Not your rank, not your medals, your name." He turned back to the camera. "And I need everybody at home to pull out their phone right now." He turned to the production booth. "Get me Harold's son." Harold's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Renata, beside him, glanced at her father. Harold had a son, Marcus, 51, from his first marriage, who lived in Sacramento, 40 minutes from the studio, and who had not spoken to Harold in 7 years. The estrangement had the shape that estrangements in military families often have. Not one event, but an accumulation of silences, of deployments and their aftermaths, of a father who had learned to be present by being still, and a son who had needed movement and had eventually moved away from the stillness entirely. Renata had Marcus's number. She had always had Marcus's number. She had not told Harold this. She told him now. Harold looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Steve made the call. Marcus Briggs answered on the second ring. He was 40 minutes away and in his car within 4 minutes of the call ending, and he walked through the studio door 17 minutes after that, still in his work clothes. And Harold stood up when he came in, and Marcus stopped walking when he saw his father in the new boots, standing straight, holding the flag, and the two of them looked at each other across a studio floor for a long moment before Marcus crossed it. They did not hug immediately. They stood close, facing each other, the way men sometimes do when the feeling is too large for the body to know what to do with it. Then Marcus put his hand on his father's shoulder, the same gesture Harold had used with Steve, and Harold's free hand came up and gripped his son's forearm, and that was enough. That was the whole thing. The audience let out a breath that had been held for approximately 4 minutes, and then they stood. But Steve wasn't done. The Barefoot Mile Foundation was incorporated in California in January 2022. Its mission? To fund cobbler services, footwear replacement, and transportation support for elderly veterans who lack access to basic material needs, combined with an outreach program for veteran mental health, specifically targeting the gap between need and first VA appointment. In its first year, the foundation served 1,800 veterans across 12 states. By 2023, that number was 9,400. The foundation's Mental Health Bridge program, which provides interim counseling support during VA wait times, has since been cited by the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee as a model for closing the appointment gap. The clip of Steve walking back through the door, carrying the boot box, reached 35 million views in the first 24 hours. The full taping crossed 160 million views within 3 weeks. The hashtag #YouCarriedUsHome trended in 28 countries. Harold Briggs was invited to throw the first pitch at a Biloxi Shuckers minor league game the following April. He wore the boots. He threw a strike. Marcus Briggs drives to Biloxi twice a month now. He and Harold do not always talk much. Sometimes they watch the game. Sometimes Harold laces up his boots and they walk the neighborhood in the early morning, the way Harold used to walk it alone, at a pace Marcus has had to learn to match. Steady, deliberate, each step placed with intention. Marcus has not said publicly what those walks are like. He has said only that he should have made the drive a long time ago, and that he is making it now. Simone Briggs graduated high school in the spring of 2023. She wrote her college application essay about the hallway, about standing in the dark and listening and deciding not to look away. She was accepted to Howard University, where she is studying journalism. Her grandfather called her when the acceptance letter came. He said one word: good. The boots on Harold's front porch in Biloxi are still there. He did not throw them away, and he did not have them repaired. He set them beside the door when the new ones arrived, and they have stayed there through 2 hurricane seasons and a Mississippi summer. And the leather is going gray at the toes now, and the split sole has opened a little wider, and they look like what they are: 60 years of showing up, set down at last. Not discarded, not displayed, just resting. Some things hold together long past the point where they should be allowed to fall apart, because the person wearing them will not stop moving long enough to notice. And some things fall apart at exactly the right moment, when the person wearing them has finally gotten somewhere safe enough to take them off. Harold Briggs wore his boots until they gave out, and then he showed up anyway, in his socks, with his flag, in a television studio in Los Angeles. And a 6-year-old said the truest thing anyone said that day. And a man who had carried a nation on his back for 60 years finally let someone carry something for him. That is not a small thing. That is the whole thing. If this story reached you, if you know a veteran who is waiting, who is quiet, who has stopped putting on their boots, share this video. Leave the word "boots" in the comments so we know who was here until the end. And if you can give anything to the Barefoot Mile Foundation, the link is in the description. Because showing up is what Harold taught us. And now, it's our turn.